All right. So our first question was, how may we reimagine diverse students, families, and communities from an asset-based module? Um, Khalifa's article did a really nice job. They talked about different types of names that they've called it. Khalifa chooses to call it culturally responsive school leadership, but it's also been called culturally compatible, cultural collusion, culturally proficient. But I liked how Khalifa really summed it up and said that they all share this common central point. They need children's educators and educational context to understand, respond, incorporate, accommodate, and ultimately celebrate the entirety of children that they serve, including the languages, literacies, spiritual universes, cultures, racial productivities, behaviors, knowledges, and critical thought and appearances of these students. So it's really a different take on looking at them as a negative and now looking at it as an asset of these students and really celebrating them.
Another aspect of that some of the authors address, particularly also, is the way that we have to sort of reckon with the ways that schools are at fault. So Yasso makes the point, that we have a tendency to look at the school as an institution that works as is, and the students as the problem, and explains that our cultural capital refers to the accumulation of cultural knowledge, social capital, educational capital, economic capital, and saying that there are, two ways we get that. We either inherit it from our family or we learn it in schools. But if we aren't willing to name that there is a problem in schools and that there's a problem in the way schools function, then we aren't going to be teaching students how to navigate those things. We're not going to teach them how to develop or earn or grow their social, cultural, and educational capital, because we're going to keep pretending that that they're not cut off from it already. So we won't be naming that problem.
Okay, great. The second question that we had was identify and describe asset frameworks and leadership practices that exemplify asset-based frames. And one of the first things we looked at was the Khalifa's 4 layers. One being a leader needs to have awareness of self and his or her values. Number 2 being the crucial role of a school leader is ensuring that teachers are and remain cultural responsive. 3 being, in addition to being recruiting, retaining, and developing teachers directly, school leaders must actually promote a responsive school context. And I think that was one of the things that really resonated with me was, again, kind of invest with who you have in your building and who you're recruiting to be a school responsive school. And then the last 4 layer was needs to engage students and parents and community, which we'll talk about in a second.
Going off of the 4 layers of leadership, the initial exploration of community-based framework article went into a community-based definitional framework that had 4 components as well. One of those being the community-based, where each community of color by race and or ethnicity decides for itself what the focus of educational equity should be. Goes into democracy-based, where communities of color, through democratic means, they design and make the decisions of how educational equity should be defined. Context-based, the assets and challenges of one community of color in one geographical area are not the same as those of another geographical area. Thus, each geographical area has its own unique assets and challenges, and each will define for itself the nature of educational equity. And then time-based, and that conditions within a community of color change based on the dynamic challenges and needs the community faces. Thus, each community may change its definition as time changes. And I think that goes a little bit off of what Sarah said, where if the school's not working for the students anymore, it's the framework of taking it on a community by community basis and letting the people in that community make the decisions and defining that equity for what works best for the students that they know so well.
So I want to go off of like the community piece and talk about parents. A big piece of the asset-based framework would be like parent engagement. That's a big piece. Like they're a big piece of capital, and we need to use them as a resource versus just acting like they're not. We spend a lot of time, Yasso mentioned in his article, like we spend a lot of time having the parents and community trying to conform to us, when current research shows having parents that are involved is actually better for your students. So 3 conjectures came from the Barton article, that parental engagement is the mediation between space and capital by parents in relation to others in school settings, that mediation must be understood as both action and orientation to action, and that the differences in parental engagement across different kinds of space in urban schools. I think sometimes we expect parents who are in urban schools to adjust to us versus us trying to adjust to them. Like, I can relate a lot to this when we were scheduling conferences. There were some teachers in our building that just scheduled conferences for parents and said, yep, this is when you're going to show up. And then there were those of us that would meet like before school with parents or after school, or we did a drop-in session. So adjusting to our parents to allow them to have that time to be engaged in their child's like learning and things like that really is powerful. And I noticed a big improvement in those kids.
Definitely. I think as we look at the first question of how we're reimagining students in an assets-based framework, and you look to the 3 pieces of leadership, parents, and community, all of those frameworks are kind of taking a shift to being more accessible to the student rather than students adapting to what previously fit.